Inconvenient truths that every leader needs to know about digital transformation. That is the topic of today's conversation here today. Thank you for joining our weekly live discussion. My name is 𝗟𝗘𝗓𝗧. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent tech agnostic consulting company that helps organizations throughout the world with their digital transformation journeys. And we have offices in the US, Europe, and Asia Pacific. So have a global client base and work with a global team. So we're going to share some of our insights here today based on that global experience. Before we jump into today's topic, which I'm really excited for because this is a controversial topic, it's something that I think we don't talk enough about in the industry. It's the inconvenient truths, and I think a lot of times leaders have a rose-colored view of what these sorts of projects look like. They have an oversimplistic view of what these projects will typically look like, and the thing that baffles me of doing this for 25 plus years of helping organizations with their digital transformations is how we keep repeating the same mistakes year after year, decade after decade. And as much as technology has changed, the way we implement and the way we approach digital transformations has not changed. We're still implementing enterprise technologies, and we're still going through automation and digital transformation projects like it's still 1995. And so what I want to do today is talk about some of those inconvenient truths that lead us to failure that leaders need to understand. And so if you know a leader on your project team or an executive sponsor or executive team member or any sort of leader on a digital transformation, make sure you share this conversation with them. Even after the fact, you can share the recording with them on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, X, and TikTok. Speaking of which, we're streaming to all those platforms. If you have any questions along the way, any comments, please jump into the conversation. I'm watching the stream across all the platforms here. So I'm really excited to hear your feedback on some of these controversial topics that I'll cover here today. And also, I'd love to hear from you as we're going through the conversation, what you think some of the biggest inconvenient truths are. Those truths that we don't like to admit as an industry, the truths that software vendors don't necessarily want you to know because it doesn't help sell software, the truth that a lot of consulting firms don't want to talk about because of their own biases and their own conflicts of interest. Love to hear any feedback you have, any thoughts you have around inconvenient truths. And I've got a handful that I'm going to bring to the table here today to discuss and get your feedback on. So I will be watching the chat. So please drop any comments or questions you have along the way. As we get started here today, though, I would love to hear where in the world you're joining from. So if you don't mind dropping in the chat, what city and country are you joining from today? I'm in Denver, Colorado in the United States here today. So I'd love to hear where you're all joining from. We tend to draw people from all over the world. It's always fun to compare notes and see where we're all joining from. So again, inconvenient truths about digital transformation. And the goal here today is to discuss some of the things that lead to unrealistic expectations and lead to misalignment within organizations. These are the things that we don't necessarily know a lot of times going into digital transformations, but we all need to know and we all need to understand. And it's a way to really hopefully open up the blinders a little bit or take the blinders off and open up our minds to what these projects should look like. And certainly I'm going to share some of the lessons that we have from having helped so many companies through these sorts of projects. A lot of what we're going to talk about here today, by the way, as a shameless plug, is from my new book called Welcome to the Jungle. So if you scan this QR code right here, you can learn more about the book. You can order it electronically or paperback or hard copy. Wherever in the world you are, you can get your hands on a copy on Amazon. So be sure to check that out. It's my new book called Welcome to the Jungle. And in that book, there's a lot of discussion around digital transformation and ERP failure case studies and some of the lessons from those failures. And I'm pulling some of the themes from the book into today's conversation. So if you're interested in this sort of thing, this sort of no BS, unbiased, objective view of what it takes to be successful in digital transformations and how to avoid failure, another supplementary resource that I'd suggest to you is that book, Welcome to the Jungle. So be sure to check that out with the QR code in front of you. And I'll leave that up here for just a moment as we're getting into the conversation. So again, let me know where you're joining from today. Let me know what comments you have here today. I want to say hello to some people from the audience already chiming in. Darian on LinkedIn says, good morning. Thank you for that. Sanjay on LinkedIn, good morning. Thank you for being here. Rashida says bonjour from France. Thank you for being here today. Tone on LinkedIn from North Yorkshire, UK. Thank you for being here. Milos on LinkedIn from Amsterdam. Thank you for being here. And I appreciate you all joining here today. And we already have the first question here from Patrick on LinkedIn. Patrick says, is tech really about truth other than marketing innovations these days? Um, and I think you might be partially kidding with that comment, but I think you actually might be onto something. In all seriousness, there's a lot of misinformation, I would say, in today's technology, sales, and marketing world, and so that is one of the first problems that organizations run into is that they hear the sales and marketing messaging. The sales and marketing messaging tells us what we want to hear, which is these projects are going to be easier than we think, and the technology is going to be even more amazing than we could ever dream. And that sales and marketing message is what leads us down the path to just put the blinders on, to stick our head in the sand and not see blind spots that are apparent in the industry. So yes, marketing innovation, I think, is a good way to put it. Especially one of the threads I'm going to get to here in just a moment is going to be around the readiness or the reality of AI, and how many of these vendors really have AI capabilities versus more of a sales and marketing story that's being told. And I think that's where we are in the enterprise tech space. We're making this transition, still making that transition to the cloud. We're certainly even earlier in the transition to an AI world. And so a lot of these products in the marketplace just aren't complete. They're just not what you might expect them to be. And they're certainly not going to be as mature in some cases as your legacy system. And I think that's the real inconvenient truth that I know the software industry doesn't want to talk about. They hate when I say that. But the reality is, if you're running, Microsoft Dynamics or SAP ECC or Oracle eBusiness Suite, one of these legacy systems from 10 or 20 years ago, yes, they are not. Yes, it is true that they are not the most modern, bleeding edge technology in the world, but for many of you, those legacy systems are probably working pretty well. They're probably pretty stable. They're probably pretty mature, just because they've been around for a long time, and there's been a lot of R&D and innovation that's been put into these products. And for many of you, you've built your own intellectual property in those systems in the form of customization. And as bad of a word as customization is in this industry, it's worth talking about. Is customization really a bad thing, or is that just because software vendors don't want you to customize because they want you in the cloud? They want you in multi-tenant cloud environments where there's less opportunity for customization. And that's what you have to ask yourself. Is it good for me, or is it good for the vendor? Ideally, you find a situation that's good for both of you, but too often organizations make decisions that are good for the vendors, but not good for them. And that's part of what we'll talk about here today. I want to say hello to Amar on LinkedIn, joining from Algeria. Thank you for being here today. Someone, although I can't see the name on LinkedIn, someone from the Netherlands is joining as well. So hello, thank you for joining. I was just there a few months ago in Amsterdam and some of the surrounding areas. And then a question on LinkedIn: can I order your book with your signature? Yes, of course you can. If you buy it, if you send it to me, I will sign it and send it back to you if you just tell me where to send it. So if you order on Amazon, I can drop my mailing address in the chat here, and you can send it to my office. I'll sign it for you, personalize it, and send it back to you. So be happy to do that. All right, so let's jump into it. Let's jump into some of the thoughts I have here. And again, please keep the conversation rolling. I'm here to just start a conversation and maybe even start some controversy, maybe start an argument or a debate. Who knows? We'll see how it goes. But that's really more about hearing from you more than anything. But one of the first inconvenient truths that I want to start with is that people will be your biggest digital transformation challenge. And yet people, change management, and the people and adoption aspects of digital transformation oftentimes gets severely neglected in these projects. And the reason for this is actually going to tie into and spill over into some of the other topics or truths that I'm going to bring up here in a moment. But part of the reason why this is so true is that when you get involved in a digital transformation, a couple things happen. One is obviously you're talking to software vendors. Software vendors are a key part of the equation of what it takes to make a digital transformation successful. Without their products, without some sort of technology enabling improvements, it's difficult to actually see your business change and advance and improve. So of course you turn to software vendors and you try to get their take on what their software can and can't do and whether or not it's a good fit for your organization. And then what happens is the myopic focus becomes focused on features and functions and bells and whistles and the actual technology itself. And so you make a decision based on technology itself, which so far, nothing terrible is happening yet, but we make a decision based on technology. And then we go to allocate budget and resources and time and focus. And the overwhelming majority of that shifts to the vendor. So it becomes more about the software solution, the software product, how am I going to design and build and deploy this thing? How am I going to get through all the test cycles? How am I going to ensure that I've got the right integration testing, the data migration plan? You just get caught up in all these technical details that are necessary, but they are not the most important thing. Yet we allocate, I would say, on average, a project probably spends 80 to 90% of their time, budget, resources, et cetera, on technology, on building technology. And to me, that's actually the least important part of a transformation. Even though you need the technology, I'd much rather see an organization scale back their use of technology, take more of an incremental improvement approach to technology, and invest more time and money in people and process. Because that people and process stuff is what really makes it stick. There's so many situations where we get called into a project recovery and the client says, hey, this project is failing, or maybe it already failed. Our vendor has failed us. Our system integrator failed us. We failed. Everyone failed. This project's a mess. Can you help us fix it? And so often you look at those situations and you see that you look at the statement of work that the integrator or the implementer was committed to. You look at the software contracts, and oftentimes everything is sound. Like they've actually delivered what they said they would deliver and what they were contractually obligated to deliver, which is a working, functioning technology. But a working, functioning technology does not mean it is integrated into your business and it actually helps your business. It doesn't even mean it's being used by your business. It just means you have a system that quote unquote works from a technology perspective. Doesn't necessarily mean your people are actually using it and you're deploying it in your day-to-day operations. And those are two very different things. And so I guess I would challenge you and your leadership teams at digital transformations to think about, are we really spending enough time and money on the people and process side of things? Or are we myopically focused on investing in technology because the software vendor, the implementation service provider is convincing you that that is the core of the digital transformation? That's where the money needs to go. They're going to suck up as much time and air out of the project as possible, in money and budget from the project. So it's in their, there's a conflict of interest there that I'm going to come back to in a moment. But that conflict of interest, that misaligned goal between you and your outside vendors is a real problem. And it's up to you, the buyer, the client, the end client, it's up to you to decide how that money gets allocated and to reinvest and to allocate resources where you think you're going to be successful, not necessarily where the vendor says that you should be investing. And oftentimes those are two very different answers that you might run into. So people will be your biggest digital transformation challenge. One thing I like to say, which is absolutely true, is that I have yet to meet that executive after the fact who said, you know what, project went well. We had a successful project, but we wish we wouldn't have spent so much time on change management. Or even yet, I haven't heard anyone say that they feel comfortable that they spent enough time on change management after the fact. Even in cases where we're helping the client through change management, they still feel like we could have done more. We could have spent more time. We could have invested more in our people. And that's a way you've got to think about this, because it's a lot easier to turn up the technology later and add more technology later. But once you've committed to this big, massive technology footprint and it starts sucking up your time and resources and focus, it's really hard to undo that. And it's a lot easier to say, you know what, maybe we can take on, maybe we were a little too conservative in our use of technology. Maybe we can expand that footprint a little bit. It's a lot easier to do that later than to overcommit early on, knowing that you're setting yourself up down a path to not invest nearly enough in change management. So that's something I would keep in mind. But I'd love to hear from you all what your thoughts are on change management, the people side of transformation. Have you seen it invested adequately in your initiatives or in your past or current projects you're working on? Have you experienced specific people and change management challenges? I'd love to hear some of your feedback from the audience here as well. I want to say hello to Patrick on LinkedIn. Thank you for joining here today, Patrick, and appreciate you joining. So people will be your biggest digital transformation challenge. That's one inconvenient truth. Another one I want to unpack and submit to you as a suggested inconvenient truth that the industry doesn't like to talk about is the myth of AI-ready ERPs. Just when I thought I'd seen as much hype as there could possibly be in the enterprise tech space in the form of cloud. Cloud was such a hyped thing, and it has been such a hyped thing for the last 10 years or so. But then along comes AI and just completely outdoes cloud. And now AI is even more buzzworthy. and understandably so, because AI has caught on really quickly, both at the consumer level, the end consumer level, as well as the business level. And I think that's probably the big differentiator here is now in our personal lives, we're all using ChatGPT or Gemini or Grok or whatever for varying purposes in our personal lives. So it makes it a lot easier and more palatable to think that you should have AI within enterprise technologies as well. So that one's been super fascinating to watch, just how much buzz and how much focus is on AI. But there are so many technologies out there that claim to have AI capabilities and they don't really, or it's nothing new. It's what the systems have always done. Like if you look at something like, for those of you that are in manufacturing that have MRP, and if you're not in manufacturing, MRP stands for material resource planning. And MRP is essentially the way a manufacturer plans all their raw material procurement, the planning on the shop floor, basically planning to meet a demand forecast. So, we expect demand to be this. So backing into that, we need to order raw materials at this point, have it on the shop floor for production at this point, and have it, in the warehouse ready to ship to a customer by whatever date. That's the whole process is MRP. And for decades now, ERP providers have been trying to crack the code on how to make a better MRP product or a better MRP capability. And in some cases, there's been some light AI or light algorithm type math or data processing that has enabled that. So now with AI, you put a new label on it. You say that's AI. Now we've got AI that helps you with your MRP and your overall production planning. In many cases, it's nothing new and it's not anything more advanced than what was out before. And in many cases, the vendors are selling capabilities that they're developing, but they aren't in production yet. I spent a lot of time, especially this year. This year in 2025 was the year of all the years of my career where I went to the most software vendor conferences. I probably went to 15 different technology conferences, vendor conferences. And it was fascinating to see how much is on the roadmap, but how little is actually in production, and not only not in production, but not only not being used by customers yet because they haven't had time to deploy the capabilities when they do exist. But in some cases, the capabilities don't even exist yet. It's just something that's on the roadmap. So you really have to vet through that. And when you're evaluating potential ERP systems, you just want to make sure that you're understanding what you actually are getting now versus what you might get in some sort of pipe dream vision of the future that you're being sold when you go through the evaluation process. So I'd love to hear from you, though. Any of you using some of the more modern ERP systems, the newer ERP systems, I'd love to hear from you. What kind of AI capabilities are you seeing? Are you seeing some cool stuff or stuff that's missing, or some limited use case experience or successes you have? I'd love to hear your feedback on AI as it relates to enterprise technology. Someone on LinkedIn, and again, I apologize, whoever this someone is, it's not giving me your name on the platform here, the streaming platform. But someone on LinkedIn says people are the real problem. I totally agree with that. I'm going to put up a comment here. It won't all fit, but I'm going to try to summarize this for you. So this is from Amar on LinkedIn. Amar says, people are the real problem. I believe many ERP projects fail because some decision makers choose the solution that best serves their own career rather than the organization's needs. And that's a really good point, because I'm going to talk in a moment about how software vendors and consultants oftentimes are the guilty culprits of creating bias in these sorts of projects, not only in the evaluation phase of evaluating technology, but in the way the technology gets deployed. But something we don't talk about either is that internal bias. And it could be because it's going to further your career, as Amar mentions here. It could be that I want us to deploy SAP or whatever it is because I feel like the SAP path in that experience is going to be better for me in my career longer term. We're all human. We're all going to have some sort of bias in that way, I suppose. But it is something to be aware of. If you have a CIO, especially a CIO or any C-level person that's coming in to lead the charge on one of these projects, and if they have the answer prematurely, you have to ask, like, why is that? Why is that person so biased for or against a certain product? And a lot of times it's not just career enhancement, which is going to help my career most, but a lot of times it is, it's just, that's what I know. I deployed SAP or I deployed Oracle or Microsoft or whatever at my previous company. I just know the product. I'm comfortable with it. And I'm a lot more comfortable deploying that again than trying something new, even if it's not the right choice in this particular situation. So I think those internal biases and blind spots are very real. And it's a really good point that Amar brings up here. And then he goes on to say, here's another really good point. Amar goes on to say, it's the classic logic behind the saying, no CIO has ever been fired for choosing SAP. Except I can give you a whole list of people that have been fired for choosing SAP, but that's a whole nother story. That's the reality. People do get fired for choosing SAP. They get fired for choosing Accenture. They get fired for choosing Deloitte all the time. And many times they're getting sued over it too in court. And a lot of what we do is expert witness work. So we get to see some of these court cases up close and personal. And there are so many people that get fired for making these decisions, yet the perception is still that that's a safe option. I think there's also this weird perception that, well, if this thing's going to go down in flames, at least I can say I did my best by choosing a blue chip product and a blue chip implementation provider. So I'll go get S4HANA. I'll get Deloitte in here. At least if we fail, I can say at least I got the best possible option out there, which I would argue is not the best possible option out there necessarily. But that perception is warped in the space, and people still have this perception that choosing SAP or insert big vendor name here, people still have that perception that it's a safe bet, when I would argue it's actually probably more risky to choose one of those big ones, and the failure rates tend to be higher with those bigger providers. So you've got to ask yourself, is that really the safe bet or not? Now, I guess from a COIA personal, protecting your own your self-interest and perception of yourself, I suppose if you fail and you chose a no-name vendor or a no-name technical implementer, then people will start to question you. Maybe it's because you didn't choose one of the bigger, well-known products. So there's a lot of that goes on as well. But again, that's all perception, not reality, in my opinion. And then Amar goes on to say, and this is where it cuts off the screen here for the audience, but I'll read it to you anyway. He says, this behavior aligns perfectly with public choice theory, which explains that individuals tend to act in their own self-interest, favoring safe and defensible choices over those that are truly optimal. Really, really well said. I'm not familiar with public choice theory, but the way you describe it is, I would say, spot on with what I've seen in terms of organizational behavior that lead to some suboptimal and in some cases terrible decisions. So thank you for that feedback, Amar. Here's a follow-up question. My comment about AI and ERP systems not being AI ready. This is from Darian on LinkedIn. Darian says, you mentioned that most enterprise AI is still more marketing than substance. What practical signs should executives look for to distinguish real AI capability from AI washing? I think the big thing here is to actually see AI in action. When you go through the demo and evaluation process, if you can actually see using your, sort of day in the life scenarios of how you run your business or what you need to do as a business, if you can see some real life scenarios of how AI could be used in those situations and see it demonstrated to you live rather than a PowerPoint slide with cool graphics showing a bunch of AI stuff on it, that's the key, is to see it. And you also want to make sure you're not just seeing the cool AI stuff that they want to show you, which, in some ways, vendors are going to have ideas or capabilities that you wouldn't have thought of. So you want to be open to that. But at the end of the day, what really matters is what you need to run your business and which of these capabilities you're actually going to use to run your business. And those are two different things. And so making sure that you are evaluating real AI capabilities in the context of what it is you need as a business and how you run your business and how you would realistically potentially leverage AI, I think that's the really important part there. Another question here from LinkedIn. Comment is, I agree, but more nuanced. It is not the people that fail in an ERP implementation, but the organization. The question should be, is the organization ready for using ERP, not which system to choose, how much consultancy, whether or not you use train the trainer, et cetera. So that's a really good point. And I do think it's not individual people necessarily. It's typically, there are individual, psychological and organizational behavior type stuff that happens at the individual micro level, but a lot of this is more bigger picture than that, in terms of, the overall organization. I do agree that you want to ensure that you're ready. And think about this again and again. This is a spoiler alert or spilling over into a topic I'm going to bring up here in a moment. But you have to think about software vendors and what their interests are. Just back up for a second and think about the psychology of, just human behavior, understandable human behavior. And that's what I'm trying to do here today is all these things that we talk about, there are good reasons behind why people don't like to admit these truths or they don't understand these truths. I don't think it's coming from a bad place. It's not, I don't think this is a situation where we're all just nefarious bad actors that are out there trying to lie to one another and greed is overpowering the industry or anything like that. There might be some of that, but the reality is that vendors want to sell software, and to sell software, it doesn't do me any good to overcomplicate or overstate the risks of the project. If I freak you out and start asking, are you really ready to deploy ERP software? I'm a sales guy. That's not helping my cause here. I need to sell you software. And again, I'm speaking out loud as a short-sighted salesperson. This is not always true. Occasionally you see people that can rise above that short-term thinking and they can think bigger picture and they can think about the longer-term implications. But let's be honest. I mean, sales reps, people that make commission on these sales, they are short-term incentive focused. That's how they're paid. That's how they're compensated. They need to get the deal done this quarter, not next year. So what am I going to do to get this done this quarter? Certainly telling you to get ready and make sure you spend time preparing for an implementation does not help my cause. So I'm probably going to do the opposite of that. I'm going to rush the implementation. I'm going to rush your decision to just sign the contract. We'll figure out the other stuff later. I've got this great deal that's about to expire. I want you to get the best deal possible. And by the way, I also want to get my commission check. So I need you to sign this contract now. We'll figure out the implementation later. And then you sign the contract and it then shifts into another bias or another conflict of interest where now you've got a big technology consulting firm that is chomping at the bit to get their services meter running so that they can start generating revenue from themselves. So again, it doesn't do us any good to say, well, hold on, before you bring on the army of consultants, let's get ready ourselves. That doesn't help us. It doesn't help our cause to generate our own self-interest in revenue and self-interest. So that's what we have to think about is where is the bias coming from? It's understandable in many cases, doesn't make it okay, but at least we understand it and then we can see through it or sift past it. So I do agree with you that, making sure that you're ready for ERP is something that oftentimes gets overlooked. And even once you've made a decision and you're going to do an implementation, that moment from the time you make the decision of the software solution that you're going to deploy or the solutions you're going to deploy, that moment until you actually start the project in earnest, the technology work stream in earnest, that is arguably the most important phase of the project, but typically it gets skipped. Like typically you sign a contract, consultants are showing up tomorrow or they're showing up Monday, and there's 50 of them. They're going to be on site crawling all over your office, trying to figure out how to design and build software. That's the wrong way to do it. I mean, you're starting off behind the 8 ball and you're starting off at a disadvantage because now you've lost control of the project. The vendor is coming in and taking over the project for you if you're not ready. And by the way, it's going to cost you exponentially more money by starting that quickly because now you're just burning money. Your run rate is running hot. The meter is running hot every month, every quarter that you've got these big bloated consulting teams out there without any clear direction or clear alignment of your internal team. All that stuff needs to be figured out. It's a messy process and you need to get that messiness out on the table and work through it early in the project in phase 0 before you bring on the technology consultants. And that is such an important point that so many organizations miss. And if there's one thing you do, and I would say this is probably even more important than the technology you pick, and I think this might be what this person is alluding to as well, is choosing the right software. Yeah, it's important, but I would say what's even more important is getting that phase 0 piece of it right. Because if you can work through the misalignment and get everyone on the same page and have a clear vision of what it is you want the project to be and how you want it to impact your business, you set up your own PMO, your own governance of the overall project. The more time you spend doing that, the more controls and risk mitigation mechanisms you have in place to avoid some of the common challenges that organizations often face when they go through these sorts of projects. So great point here. It's organizational wide. It's a broad organizational behavior issue that leads to some of these challenges. Another comment on LinkedIn, same for AI. It's not the tools available, but if the organization is truly ready for it, if you give a sniper rifle to a cave dweller, he or she will complain it's a lousy club. really good analogy there. So yeah, you need to ensure the organization's ready, ensure they understand why they're going through the project, what it means to the organization, et cetera. This is from Tone on YouTube. Tone says, as a technologist working outside or alongside ERP implementations, the monolithic closed shop nature of an ERP system appears to be so monolithic that it's all or nothing. It's a good point. And I think we're going to come back to this in a moment too. A lot of these themes that I'm going to talk about here today they sort of spill over into one another. But that is why there are some lawsuits or some, not lawsuits, but some, actually there is a lawsuit involving Epic Software, which is an electronic medical record provider for the healthcare industry. There's a lawsuit against Epic for their closed ecosystem and the inability to bring in outside third parties to integrate to that core medical record information. And what's interesting about that lawsuit is it's not just about the technology being closed off. It's the fact that it is negatively affecting public health. And so that's the allegations being made, is that it's not just a technology antitrust sort of, anti-competitive behavior sort of thing. It's also, this is acting counter to the interests of public health and just overall health of patients. That's one lawsuit. And then SAP has a world of issues, legal issues related to some of their anti-competitive behavior. They're being sued by Celonis, which is a business process mining tool that SAP has their own process mining tool, and they basically have closed off Celonis from being able to access SAP data to do process mining. So they're getting sued over that. And then add to that another legal issue that SAP has is in Europe. The EU is investigating them for potential antitrust and anti-competitive behavior in the third-party maintenance and support environment. So I think you're right. The closed shop nature of ERP technologies appears to be so monolithic that it's all or nothing. That hurts businesses. I mean, it hurts customers, and I think what's going to happen is going to end up hurting the vendors. They're going to have to change their ways, which I'm not a huge fan of government regulation. I'm not the type that thinks that government should be stepping into every nook and cranny of our lives, but I do think this industry, for as long as I've seen it, I think I've been doing it just long enough to where I feel like it's gotten out of control. Like if things haven't changed in 25 plus years, I don't understand how else it could possibly change it unless regulators step in and start putting some parameters in place. And I think that's what we're starting to see out of the EU. And I think we'll probably see more of that just based on some of what I would consider, I'm not an attorney, I'm not an economist, but a lot of what these bigger ERP vendors do, especially SAP. I think SAP is the most guilty of this, but some of the things they do, I think, are highly unethical. It hurts customers. And I think there's more, unfortunately, they're going to make it harder for themselves to do business, and they're going to get regulated, I think, in my opinion, just based on the behavior that they're pursuing or the strategies they're pursuing. When I was getting my master's degree, I remember I took this, I got a master's in business. So I have an MBA, and one of the classes I took, it was like a public policy. It was like law and ethics all in one class. So we look at things from a legal perspective, but then you'd have the ethical conversations about it. And I remember one of the most lasting lines or nuggets of wisdom I got from any professor in my master's program was this professor of this class who said, if you're a business leader and you don't want to be regulated, don't do things that cause regulators to want to regulate you. And I just remember thinking that's so simple and so basic, but yet very profound. And I think of that line and that professor saying that when I think of SAP. And I look at SAP and what they're doing, I'm like, they are just begging for regulation. I mean, they're pushing the boundaries so hard and so aggressively that they are begging for regulation. And I think they're going to get regulated, and I think it's going to hurt them in the long term, and it's going to stifle their innovation. I think it'll stifle them as a company, but that's a whole nother story. I have very strong opinions about SAP as a company. And by the way, I started my career as an SAP consultant, so I didn't enter the space as anti-SAP, but SAP makes it easy to dislike some of their business dealings. Okay, I understand now why I can't see the person on LinkedIn, because their profile set to private. So that makes sense. I thought I was having a technical error here. So hi, Abandi, thank you for joining on LinkedIn. I'm glad to know what your name is finally, instead of just, hey, you. Milos on LinkedIn says, fully agree with Eric on change management missing or done as an Excel exercise, ticking boxes with no consideration for human factors at play. People are not the problem. The problem is ignoring the people, and the human factor is heavily involved in every single digital transformation project. It's a great point. I do totally agree with that. Some great comments here. Thank you for all these thoughts here. So a follow-up from Tone on YouTube is that the vastness and complexity of an ERP system means that the effective change management is heavily constrained by what can be done with the ERP system. And that is a good point. Obviously, you have to manage organizational change in the context of what can and can't be done in the technology. And in some cases, the technology is actually might be a step back for some parts of your organization. It could be that your legacy, could be that your legacy system is actually more capable and more mature than any new modern cloud system. And what's really interesting about this migration to the cloud that a lot of the incumbent on-premise vendors are making is that they had these legacy products like SAP ECC, Microsoft Dynamics, Oracle eBusiness Suite, et cetera. They had these legacy on-premise systems that they spent decades developing and building, more advanced capabilities. And so as they make the shift to the cloud, which is a complete rewrite of that software, it's a new architecture, it's new coding, everything's different. They've had to recreate those capabilities, and they haven't been able to catch up, understandably, to what the capabilities were in their legacy systems. And then you add to that there are some capabilities that they've created that are only available in their cloud offering. So there's new stuff like around AI and analytics and stuff like that you don't get necessarily with the older on-premise legacy products. So it's a weird dichotomy where you're getting some new capabilities, some new cool stuff that you can't get with the old legacy systems. But then there's other stuff that's more basic and more fundamental in many cases, like especially if you're a complex manufacturer. That seems to be the industry that struggles the most with cloud adoption, not because they're more resistant to change, but because their businesses are more complex and their businesses require more flexibility than what the multi-tenant public cloud model would allow. So, that's you do have to manage change in the context of understanding that if you are deploying a new system, it could be that there's some stuff that you had that worked better than what you're going to get in the future, but it's in the name of modernizing your technology. Hopefully it's in the name of having a net positive benefit to the overall organization, even if it means that certain parts of the business are going to be quote unquote hurt by it. This is also true if you are putting more structured technology in place. And in some cases, it's perceived to be making people's jobs harder because now they have to capture information they didn't have to capture before, or it's a more stringent process intentionally. It's more of a structured, controlled process to where, it's more consistency across the enterprise, et cetera, et cetera. So it just puts more pressure on people to change, and it puts more change management pressure on as well. So all good points there. So this is a comment I started to touch upon a moment ago, but another inconvenient truth is that large ERP vendors behave more like a cartel than a competitive market. And the enterprise tech space has done a really, really good job of selling software over the years. And they have done a really good job of creating these massive ecosystems to support their sales and marketing messaging. So you look at, I'm picking on, mainly the big three here, primarily SAP, Oracle, and Microsoft, but it's true for, NetSuite and Epicor and Infor, maybe to a lesser degree, but it certainly Workday, Salesforce, et cetera. Basically what they do is, of course, you have the vendor themselves who are completely biased. They're completely focused on selling software. And to those vendors, their product is the holy grail, right? I mean, that's their job is to drink the Kool-Aid, sell the Kool-Aid, get you to buy the Kool-Aid. That's their job. So that's understandable. But then outside the world of vendors, the vendors have their implementation partners. So they bring in the Deloittes and the Accentures and the big accounting firms, and they become partners with them to where those partners now are drinking the Kool-Aid, and they're sort of perceived third-party validation of how good the Kool-Aid tastes. So now you're not just hearing it from a vendor, but you're also hearing it from perhaps your audit firm or your, the third-party consulting firm like Deloitte or Accenture, whoever. And then add to that the fact that you've got industry analysts. Now the vendors will pay industry analysts to create these reports or these quadrants that show that, I'm a my product is in the upper right quadrant of this random, very specific niche that Gartner created a quadrant for. And now all of a sudden the Kool-Aid is it's all over. All I see is how awesome this Kool-Aid is. And so that's part of it is that bias that's created in that ecosystem. But then you add to the fact, the real fuel to the fire of this point is now you add to the fact that you're sunsetting legacy products and essentially forcing your legacy customers to make a difficult decision to either upgrade to the new system, the new cloud system, where, by the way, the vendor makes a lot more money on these recurring subscription revenues than they did on the old on-premise model. And they're certainly making a lot more money by you buying a new cloud system than they're making on your maintenance. So they're willing to forego that maintenance, that 15 to 20% annual maintenance you were paying year over year. They're willing to forego that if you're willing to upgrade to the cloud, where they're going to make a lot more money into perpetuity in those cloud subscriptions. So, holding a gun to your customer's head saying, hey, either you move to this new product or we're going to cut off support, that to me if that's not anti-competitive, I don't know what is. And if that's not like the cartel, then I'm not sure what is. It's about as close to an actual cartel as you can get without being labeled as one, except I guess I am labeling them as a cartel. But that is essentially what these big vendors are doing. And in some cases, it still makes sense for you to make that upgrade, make that switch, but you just have to recognize that you're in control of these projects. The bigger vendors, especially, they like to throw their weight around and throw their leverage around and bully their customers into doing what they want. But the stronger leaders that we've worked with have been successful at pushing back and not drinking the Kool-Aid and not blindly following vendor roadmaps and whatnot. So that's an unfortunate truth. And I think that's something that has gotten a lot worse since I've been in the industry, is just the anti-competitive nature of some of these vendors is just a lot worse now than it was even just 5 or 10 years ago. It's borderline out of control, in my opinion. I'm not sure how much, I don't think it's sustainable. I don't know where we go from here, but I just don't see how that could possibly sustain itself. Either leaders are going to wisen up and push back, or they're going to get these vendors are going to get regulated, sued. They're certainly getting sued already. But I think you're going to see more litigation, more regulatory actions to try and slow this down, especially when you start seeing government and public institutions getting screwed by the vendors. I think that's where, you're crossing a line to where you're basically inviting regulation when you've got public record type situations and sketchy behavior happening that's affecting the public good, if you will. Here's a comment from William on LinkedIn. Yes, it's easy to underestimate how grasping and transactional some firms can be. More importantly, are the Broncos going to get it done this year? Of course they are. I have all the faith in the world in Bo Nix and the Denver Broncos. If you're not an American football fan, the Denver Broncos, for once in the last 10 years, are actually doing pretty well this year. And so they have a bright potential future here this season. Here's an interesting question from Milos on LinkedIn. Milo says, how do you engage with customers as a consultancy and keep interests aligned? How do you link the consultancy success to the customer success? Do you engage time, material, fixed cost, or scope, or in a different way? That's a good question. I'm not a huge fan of fixed cost, only because I think it leads to perverse unintended consequences. It leads to conflict of interest unintentionally, because now you've created a situation where you're essentially incentivizing your software vendor or your implementation partner to cut corners and to cut cost and to reduce effort, because they make more money. In fixed bid, it's sort of the opposite problem. You have a time and materials. Time and materials, you have an economic interest to bill more and more and more. Even if it should be taking you less time, you have an economic incentive to bill more. It's the opposite problem with fixed bid. Now you're being incentivized. You're incentivizing people to spend less time doing things right and getting the job done right, because the margin's higher on fixed bid if you invest less time in that project. So both models have their flaws. I would say it's a wash. I mean, they both kind of suck, honestly. I mean, the time and material kind of sucks, and so does fixed bid. I don't think that fixed bid really doesn't solve enough problems to justify moving to that model. I think the more important way, or the more effective way we've seen that work with our clients, is you have to get, first of all, the PMO, setting up your own internal enterprise PMO is really important, even if it's just for this project, because you need to be managing the vendors. The vendors should not be managing you. If a vendor tells you, oh, we've got PMO covered, we've got project management covered, they're wrong. They don't. They have their own work stream covered. They might have a technical lead for their technology work stream, but you, the customer, the end customer, should have that overarching PMO in place to manage the overall project. And not only that, but you, the PMO, need to dig in and really understand assumptions, challenge assumptions, refine plans, budgets, forecasts, all that stuff. I was just working with a client here in the last few weeks. They're starting an SAP project here in the US. And they're a upper mid-market, larger mid-sized company. And, an example I'll give you is that they signed the contract. They did phase 0 with us with third stage. So third stage was helping through the phase 0 process. And then we're continuing into the implementation by providing the program management support. We're doing the change management, a lot of the architecture, data migration type stuff, basically all the stuff that the SAP system integrator doesn't do or doesn't do well, we're helping the client do. And essentially what we're doing is we're giving control back to the client, to the customer. And what I mean by that is, one thing that the system integrator did is they had, at their peak, I think they're going to have 30 or 35 full-time people on this project. And they want those 30 or 35 people on the project like now, like starting literally now, this month in December of 2025. And we pushed back and said, no, it's way too early to bring on that entire army of consultants. You bring in a small subset to get to start laying the groundwork for what's going to come. But it's a waste of time and money to have all these people billing by the hour. And by the way, they're not just going to bill you less time because they weren't adding value or they're sitting idly waiting for you to make decisions or whatever. They're still billing for that time. I mean, you're going to get charged for that time. And so that's how these budgets get blown, is that you've got these conflicting interests and you don't have anyone managing that from a PMO perspective, managing those costs and resources. And so it's a lot like the fox guarding the hen house. I mean, if you have your vendor or your big system integrator managing the project for you, it's like grading your own homework. It's like if you were in school and you created the test, you graded the test that you took. How is that fair? How does that make sense? And how are you really going to learn? So that's the big challenge that I see in these sorts of situations. So talked about anti-competitive behavior or acting like a cartel. That's kind of to close that out. We just have to recognize that there are strong forces at work here, and may not be quite as draconian as I'm making it sound, or dystopian as I'm making it sound, but because of self-interest, because of conflicts of interest, you're going to get companies like, especially the bigger vendors, the bigger consulting firms and integrators are more likely to act like a cartel than a competitive market that truly is looking out for your best interests. And similarly with, this, I alluded to this as well, but consulting firms' incentives oftentimes conflict with your own success too. And I just mentioned a couple examples of how, if you have a big consulting firm and if you run over budget, let's just say you go 50% over budget, the fact that your consulting firm actually benefits from that is a problem. So it's like, how is that okay? Or how is that possibly going to work if we let it go unchecked? And I don't know that you can. I'd love to hear your feedback if you have a solution here, but you can't have that perverse economic incentive to see your customer fail and actually benefit from it. And vice versa. You're actually hurt as a consulting firm if the client does their part and the project goes well and you finish it on time, on budget. That actually hurts you because you would have been better off economically if the project took longer and they needed more of your time and services. So you just have to, again, recognize that there are incentives that aren't aligned with your interests. Whenever you hear a vendor that isn't willing to acknowledge or discuss the pros and cons of a decision that's being made, that's usually an indicator that there's some bias or some economic conflict of interest. You see a lot like with the whole talk of like whether or not you should move to the cloud. I mean, it's so crazy to me how blindly people will say, no, you've got to be in the cloud. If you're not in the cloud, you might as well you might as well close the doors and shut the business down now. If you're not in the cloud, you're dead. We've been hearing this for years now, and you have to ask yourself, well, why is that? Why are people so biased towards the cloud and biased against on-prem? The reason for that is pretty simple. It's because cloud software makes a lot of money, and there's a lot of investors that are making money off cloud. Software vendor stock prices skyrocket when they show positive cloud results because investors love it. And so that changes the DNA or the fabric of the entire vendor community to where they, just due to their own self-interest, they have to be biased. They have to put the blinders on and say it's all cloud or nothing. And again, creates bias throughout the entire ecosystem, because now you've got implementers, the big implementation partners now are saying the same thing. You better move to the cloud or else you're going to be dead. You better do it now. Let's sign the contract now. And anytime you see that, I think you have to say there's probably some sort of conflict of interest here if we're not even willing to have the discussion of, really, do we really need to go to the cloud? What if we stay on premise? And I love asking that as a triggering question to some of my technologist peers in the industry, some of the ones that are purist about cloud or about, no customization, clean core, all that kind of stuff. I love to challenge them and say, why? What if we didn't do that? What if we did something different? What's the worst that could happen? And I love having that conversation, because usually if you really peel back layers of the onion, you find that, first of all, there's no ideal situation. Second of all, no matter what you do, you're just shifting risks around. It's just a matter of which risks are you most comfortable with as an organization, but the risks are still there. And the minute you decide you don't want to talk about the risks, or you pretend that they're not there, that means there's some sort of bias or blind spot that you're not seeing past there. Which leads to what I think might be a controversial statement here. And I alluded to this a moment ago, but cloud ERP might be the worst decision some organizations make. And it might, first of all, I'll say it might be the best decision for the vendors that you could possibly make. And again, they love it because it's recurring revenue and they've got you locked in now. That's the other thing. That's the thing that I think is underlying here, is that I don't know when this will happen. I imagine it'll probably be like 5 to 10 years from now, but I'd say 5 to 10 years from now, there's going to be a whipsaw effect, a lot of pushback to where companies say, you know what, this cloud thing is out of control. The costs are out of control. Our OpEx costs now are way higher than they used to be. And by the way, we're not getting as much value as we might have gotten out of our older on-prem systems. So I think, I'm not saying we'll all go back to on-prem, but I do think that companies are going to wisen up. And we already see it a little bit. They're starting to wisen up and say, wait, hold on. You mean to tell me that I'm locked in? You can raise the prices anytime you want. And as you deploy new features like AI agents, like agentic AI, that's another excuse to jack up the cost, the annual cost of cloud solutions. So they've got you locked in pretty good, and it's going to be hard to get out of that contract and to move to a new system. And the vendors know that, which is why they're going through this sort of a nuclear arms race now to try to get as many of you to the cloud as possible. Because once they get you there, it is going to be really hard to switch. It was already hard enough to begin with to switch ERP systems 10 or 20 years ago. You thought it was hard then. Imagine trying to shift systems now. It's going to be a nightmare. And yet we have a whole cycle of presumably potential cloud software replacements that are going to be coming in the next 5, 10, 20 years, whatever it is. And I think that's where you're going to feel the real pain. And we're going to look back on the 2020s as the time where we made some really bad decisions and some very short-sighted, myopic decisions that the vendor community fleeced us on and basically sold us a bill of goods. And now we're locked in. And if you're lucky, yeah, maybe the software works well for you and it's going to help you scale and it's going to stay aligned with your needs longer term in the future. But if you're like most organizations, you're going to grow, you're going to change, you're going to go through acquisitions, you're going to carve out and divest certain parts of your business, you're going to enter new markets. And at some point, you're going to outgrow that system, or your needs are going to change to where you might need a different system. When that time comes, that's where many of you are going to feel the pain of the decisions that are being made now to move to the cloud. But again, I'd love to hear counterpoints here. I'm not here to tell you I'm right and anything outside of what I'm thinking is wrong. I'd love to hear your feedback. If you have other thoughts or anything to add, I'd love to hear from you. Here's a question from Prashun on LinkedIn. Says, how about transformation journey of any larger firm to choose which cloud solution? investments, resources, they depend on any AI tools. So I think what you're asking is if AI tools are being used to help with transformations. Um, and they say they do. The larger firms are saying they have AI tools, but yet we're not seeing any material reduction in costs, which I would expect to see, because so much of the work that the big consulting firms especially do is grunt work, manual development work, and even if you think about testing or creating training materials, whatever it is, that's stuff that generative AI and AI agents should be able to help with, at least speed up or automate. But yet we haven't seen a material. We haven't seen system integrators willingly come forward and say, "Hey, we're going to save you a ton of time and money now because we're using AI." And again, this is where that conflict of interest comes into play. It actually hurts the big providers, the big service providers are the ones that have the most to lose by AI, because that's going to wipe out a big part of their business. And I think that's why many of them are struggling, laying people off, is because of that. So you should see a material use of AI in your implementations. If you're not, you're probably wasting time and money, and you're missing an opportunity to optimize that cost. And again, this is where it comes back to that PMO, your own internal PMO, you managing that PMO. It's something we help our clients do all the time, is establishing their own PMO to where they can manage, and we'll advise them and help them through the process. But the point being, the client is in control of these PMOs and the governance that they put in place. Scott on LinkedIn says, great point. Clients should own the PMO. If we assign a PM for our dev teams, it is to keep our workflow in sync with the overall project goals. Really well said. Well done. Problem is, especially, and I'm not sure who you work for, Scott, but it sounds like you're probably not working for Accenture, Deloitte, KPMG, et cetera. I'm guessing, correct me if I'm wrong, but usually when you see Accenture, Deloitte, KPMG, et cetera, they are the masters of convincing you that you don't need PMO because they bring PMO to the table. You certainly don't need those crazy guys from third stage consulting coming in to help you manage them because they've got it under control. They typically don't want a firm like us in there because we're not drinking the Kool-Aid alongside with them. We're not representing them. We're not representing SAP or whoever. We're representing the client, and that is a threat to a lot of consulting firms, that they don't want independent, objective third parties involved. They don't want the client having too much control. We had one client, it's actually a Fortune 500 company here in the US. Again, SAP project with Deloitte. It's either Deloitte or Accenture. I think it's Deloitte. So SAP and Deloitte doing this big digital transformation. Deloitte had in their contract with them a clause that said that they have ultimate decision-making authority, final ultimate decision-making authority over the project. And I asked the client, I said, why did you agree to this? But, I could see maybe if it was a smaller firm, you don't have as much negotiating leverage or whatever, but this is a really big company. It's a massive project that this company's going through. So it's a lot of revenue for SAP and for Deloitte. And so it's a big deal. And I said, why did you guys agree to that? Like, why would you agree to let a vendor have ultimate decision-making authority, even if you don't agree with it or you don't want to do it? And they said, well, Deloitte threatened to walk. They threatened to not do the project if we didn't adhere to that or agree to that clause. And I said, well, then why didn't you just go find someone else? And they said, well, because Deloitte's our auditor and we have a relationship with Deloitte. And, they didn't say this, but you could sense the whole, no one ever got fired for hiring Deloitte bias come through. So, I think that's, I just bring up that story because what you're saying, Scott, is unusual and unique. I agree with you, and I commend you for taking that approach. But a lot of firms, especially the bigger ones, don't think that way, and they're thinking more short-sighted, and they're thinking more selfishly, I would say, about their own needs rather than what's truly best for the client. So thank you for that feedback there. Here's an interesting question from Amar. I'd actually turn this to the rest of the audience as well to get your take on this. But Amar says, have you experienced resistance from end users to AI-enabled solutions driven by fear about their careers and job prospects and ultimately led to project failures? Absolutely. This is a big problem that we're seeing now, is that as cool as we all think AI is, and when I say we, I mean most of us who are listening here today, we might be tired of the hype. We might be tired of everything being about AI. But at the end of the day, we're all technologists. Technology is cool. AI is cool. But the average employee does not think AI is cool. They might be using ChatGPT for their own personal lives or whatever, but doesn't necessarily mean that they're super excited to have AI now as part of their day-to-day jobs. especially when we haven't defined for those people what their jobs are going to entail going forward. When you start reading all these headline stories about, millions of jobs being lost to AI in the next 10 years or whatever, that people hear that and that resonates with them. And if they start seeing us get too excited about AI as we're rolling out within our organizations, they're going to push back on that just out of self-protection, self-preservation. So I do agree. AI is having a negative. I'd say it's a net negative with people in general. Leaders are usually pretty excited about it, but you get down to mid-level management, especially down to the front lines, those people are not excited about AI in general. Like, you've got some that are going to be, more forward thinking or whatever, more open to it. And some, we see some where it's like these people, this person's about to retire, so they really don't care. They just want to learn something new, and they're going to retire anyway. So even if you replace their job, they're not, no skin off their back. But for the average person, the average frontline employee, they do care. And it's either a distraction to their day-to-day jobs, or they're threatened by it, or they don't understand it. So there's just a lot of things that can cause negative pushback or negative resistance to AI. And I think that's something that gets overlooked in all the hype machines that we see about AI right now. I want to pull up a couple other thoughts here. I want to make sure I don't miss these because there's some good ones here. Actually, there's just one more I want to make sure I cover, and then I'm going to go back to audience questions. But last one I'll share with you here today is that ERP systems do not come with best practices. And this has been a trigger for me for a solid, I'd say 15 years now, or however long the term best practices has existed. I literally cringe every time I hear that word, especially from a software vendor, because let's be honest, there is no such thing as best practices. It just doesn't exist. I mean, it's like, I hope there's no kids listening, but it's like saying the tooth fairy exists. It just doesn't. It's just, there's no rational part of us, unless we're kids, that believe in the tooth fairy, and we don't want to shatter their dreams, but we're all adults here, and we're speaking to leaders here. You need to acknowledge that the tooth fairy does not exist, and best practices do not exist. There are best practices for your business. There's best practices that you as an organization are going to find to be best for you. That's the closest thing you're going to find to best practices. What the software vendors provide is a software that works a certain way that they decided to design it. They're not business people, they're technologists. They built technology to do certain things. They think it's the right way. It may be the right way for you, but it may not be. But for a vendor to say they have best practices is, I'd say, arrogant at best and completely misinformed and misleading at worst. So this is an important point, because especially now with the push to the cloud, so many organizations say, look, I know you customize your software, your legacy software, but customization is bad. You need a clean core. And I think SAP developed this term clean core, and I cannot stand this term because it's so misleading. And it's misinformation. I don't know what you want to call it. It's a hoax. It's fake news, whatever. It's all the above. But clean core is another concept where you're suggesting that the vendor knows best, and that you need to leave behind all of your customization, which, by the way, is in many cases intellectual property that's worth something to you as an organization, that gives you a unique differentiator or competitive advantage. But the vendor is going to convince you that their best practices are what's going to make you more competitive, which doesn't make any sense if you think about it, because if every one of your competitors was using the same clean core software, you're all operating the same. And at some point, something's got to give. Someone's got to change to outdo the other. And a lot of times that's going to involve changes to technology. So to say that best practices are going to somehow advance your business, it's just not true. So yes, there are capabilities you're going to get with new technologies. I'm not saying technology can't be a good thing or can't be something that improves your business. But to say that you should ignore your history as a company, ignore the way you do things today because that's not best practice, that's completely reckless and arrogant for a vendor to say, but yet it sells software. So ERP systems don't come with best practices. The only person that can define that is you as an organization. And, you look at a company you look at some of the massive success stories in the world, like companies that have grown quickly, exponentially, scaled beyond belief. Companies like, Amazon, Netflix, NVIDIA, whatever. I mean, there's so many companies that have been super successful, and they didn't do it because they implemented SAP Clean Core. They did it in many cases, like in the case of Amazon, they built their own proprietary technology that no one else can seem to replicate. And that creates a barrier to entry for other competitors. And that's what makes them successful. If all Amazon ever did was deploy SAP Clean Core S4HANA, they wouldn't, I guarantee they would not have become who they are today, because that's the same capability that every other e-commerce retailer out there is using if they're using S4HANA, or, pick whatever ERP vendor you want. They did it by creating something different. So if a vendor or a system integrator tries to convince you that customization is always bad, again, there's a bias there. It's because they want you in the cloud. The more you customize, the more you threaten their model, their preferred model of you moving to the cloud, clean core, public cloud, multi-tenant cloud, zero customization. That is the ultimate utopia that the vendors are looking for, because that is it's the ultimate way to scale their companies. The way they scale is for all their customers to be vanilla and just be the same. That's how they scale their companies. That does not help you. It actually hurts you, but yet that's what you're being sold. And so I think you just have to be smart about how you deploy technology, deploy off-the-shelf cloud systems where it makes sense. And there's going to be places in parts of your business where it doesn't make sense. Don't let them convince you that you're the problem, and that because you're not following best practices or you're not adopting the clean core, that you must be the problem or the ones resisting change. So that's a closing thought I'd leave you with, at least on that thread, but I'd love to hear some of your comments too. So I'm going to shift back to this as well. Comment from Vasil on LinkedIn says ERP slowly but steady will be replaced by automation workflows. Here taking a dig here at consultants, which I always love to do because I like to make fun of myself at times. So this comment here is, I think the consultants will also become more button pushers than process consultants that can find the right combination of functionality in large ERP systems. It's a negative result of these standardized cloud solutions. Could be. I mean, I think it could be that on the technology side of things, you might be right. It might be more button pushing and less of a need for the really advanced technical skill set. But I think what it will do is it'll create more opportunity and more demand for change management and people-based services, because now with cloud, for a lot of the reasons I mentioned before, cloud is more disruptive. Even if it's a net benefit to your business long-term, short-term, it's more disruptive than an on-premise implementation because of the things I mentioned before. It's less flexible. Vendors are pushing you to go to a clean core, which is really difficult. It's a lot easier said than done. And so that's going to put more pressure on the organization to change to fit the software, which means change management is going to become even more difficult, more challenging, more of a risk factors for digital transformations going forward. So it might displace some of the technology focus of consultants, but it's in a good way. I think this could be a positive thing long term. It's going to force consultants to focus on the non-technical things that matter more, because cloud systems are more disruptive to businesses as they try to adopt them. Here's an example from Scott on LinkedIn. I've already seen one example of what Eric is describing. Large transportation company moved to cloud version of current transportation management system, lost control of customization, and quickly outgrew limited cloud solution with no API interface to build around a fixed solution, moving to a competitor since the current TMS vendor did not allow reverse migration to on-prem. So that's an interesting story. Thank you for sharing that. I think there'll be many more of those types of stories in the years to come. Vasil on LinkedIn says PMO should be organized in collaboration by both the organization and the implementer. I do agree, although I will say the technical implementer is just one work stream of many. So it's not just the implementer. You have other work stream leads that you want to collaborate with. And I think the key here is that it's not the myopic focus on the implementer, the technical implementer. I think that's the challenge or the problem, because it's too much focus on a product. So you need their involvement and their collaboration, but you just as important, if not more important, you need the same from your change management team, your overall architecture, your data migration team, all those different work streams that factor in. We have one project now where we're doing an Infor cloud suite implementation, but the client is also implementing Adobe Acrobat and some other, Salesforce and other systems to bolt on to Infor Cloud Suite. So each of those technologies has its own work stream, its own project manager / lead that ties up to our PMO. So the PMO manages all the different technologies and all the non-technology pieces as well. So that PMO thing is even more important, especially for organizations that are implementing multiple technologies, which is becoming, I think, in today's cloud world, that's going to become more and more common, especially with composable ERP, best of breed becoming more palatable nowadays. I think that's what we'll see going forward. Ken on LinkedIn says, I'm experiencing that currently with a public sector company. Deloitte is the fox guarding their own clients, chicken coop. How do we professionally guide our client through this? This is a great question and something that I struggle with. Deloitte and Accenture, I came from PwC, so I'd lump PwC in this category as well, of those big consultancies, and it was actually a really fascinating learning experience to have been on the inside of one of these big four consulting firms, because I saw how good we were. I mean, we were so good at keeping other third parties out of the picture. We were really good at it, and it was just we were good at creating this false confidence that we had it all under control, and that any attempt to manage us or to get too transparent into what we were doing, that was going to threaten or risk the project. It was really weird. We were good at making it not about us. It was actually, it was almost like the client was making the decision that they wanted us guarding the chicken coop, our own chicken coop, because that was going to make the project more successful. It's sort of a weird circular reasoning that worked. And we were really good at it. I see it all the time with Deloitte, Accenture, especially. Sometimes, KPMG, just as a generalization, isn't as bad. PwC, as a broad generalization, isn't quite as bad. Deloitte and Accenture are the worst, I'd say, at this, or the best, depending on how you look at it. But they're really good at keeping out, like they don't want a third party objective in there. They don't want an objective third party of any sort, whether it's client side, whether it's a third party like Third Stage Consulting, because we challenge the status quo. We challenge, do we need 100 people on this project? That doesn't make sense. Do we need 100 people on the project right now? That doesn't make sense. Why don't we phase this? Why don't we, get a realistic plan and resource plan in place? So, but the point being that, you just have to prove that you're there to help the client. You have no biases. You have no skin in the game on, how much of, I don't know if it's an SAP project or whatever you're working on here, Workday or whatever. It's not a matter of you wanting to sell more software, as is the case, by the way, with Deloitte or Accenture. They partner with these big technology providers, and their job is to not only generate services revenue, but to generate subscription revenue for their partners, which they partake in. There are some, I don't know, I don't think this is true for Deloitte or Accenture, but there are some, I'd say, mid-tier, larger system integrators that make more money on recurring subscription revenue commission than they make on services. And to me, that's another, nuanced conflict of interest, because now you have this perverse incentive to get a client to basically jam as much technology down a client's throat as possible, because you're going to make a ton of money by doing that. And so that's the other thing that the big implementers will do, is everything becomes SAP first, or Workday first, Oracle first, whatever whatever technology it is they're deploying based on the partnership they have in that part of the company. That's one thing we see very commonly. There's a comment from Prashun on LinkedIn. And Eric, I have a question regarding SAP's cloud strategy. There's a circulating statement that SAP will stop supporting the private cloud edition and standardize everything on public edition. But based on SAP's published roadmap and product updates, both editions are still active lines. Can you clarify whether SAP has made any formal announcement on this and share the official communication if it exists? I do not believe SAP has formally decided that everything is going to go to public cloud, but I do know that's where they're pushing hard. I mean, that eventually we're going to get there. Eventually they're going to get there as far as public cloud, SAP or S4HANA public cloud, or I guess it's not even called S4HANA technically anymore. They renamed it just SAP Cloud ERP. So cloud ERP eventually, I think, will just be public cloud. I don't think it's sustainable for them to maintain both. Certainly not sustainable to maintain S4HANA on-prem, S4HANA private cloud, and S4HANA public cloud. So eventually, they're going to try and get everyone over to public cloud. I think that's what has to happen if you're SAP. I don't know that they formally announced that, though. So I do not have a formal statement behind that, but just from their actions and what you see in the market and just what of how vendors operate and how their R&D works, it seems inevitable that public cloud is where we'll head. But as of right now, we have more clients that are implementing private cloud for SAP than public cloud. We have one or two clients that are implementing public. The rest of our SAP customers are implementing private cloud at the moment. So, but I wouldn't be surprised if that changes in the near future. All right, there's so many questions here. We could spend hours on this topic, or I could. I don't know if you guys could, but I love this. I love this topic. So another comment on LinkedIn: for the larger consulting firms, it's sadly often not customer first. And then from Tone on LinkedIn, are there any case studies for ERP success that are genuinely impartial and describe the key ingredients with some more specificity? Well, I hate to do this to you, Tone, but I'm going to do a shameless plug here. My book, Welcome to the Jungle, actually does that. It covers failure case studies, talks about why they failed, but it also talks about successes and why they succeeded and what they did differently from the failures. So it's a good $20 investment. In my opinion, the book is a high ROI investment. If you want to buy the book for $20, there's a lot in there. And actually go to my YouTube channel too. And just, if you search on my YouTube channel, just search ERP lessons, and you'll find some failures, but you'll see some successes as well. I actually have a few where I talk specifically around leadership traits and the cultures of the companies and why they were successful and how that contributed to their success. And I compare, there's one where I whiteboard and I compare two companies that look almost identical on paper, but the decisions they made and the way they approached their projects led to two totally different outcomes with their projects. So you can find a lot of that on my YouTube channel as well for free. But if you want to dive deeper, be sure to get the book. You can scan the QR code to read more about the book, and you can buy it electronically, or you can buy paperback or hard copy, which will ship to anywhere in the world that you are. So be sure to check that out. So a lot of stuff I didn't get to here today, a lot of questions and comments I didn't get to. I want to thank you for all the great questions and comments. Thank you for that. But we'll wrap it up here in the interest of time. I could go another hour or two, but I think I'd probably bore you all to death. So want to thank you for being here today. This discussion will become part of our upcoming Transformation Ground Control podcast. So that podcast you can find at transformationgroundcontrol.com. And what we do, you're part of the live production of that podcast here today. We'll edit this video or this recording. We'll add some additional content, and we'll re-release it as a formal episode of Transformation Ground Control here in a couple of weeks. Be sure to keep an eye out for that. You can see all the past episodes of that show that I've been hosting for close to 5 years now. We're coming up on the 5-year anniversary of that podcast. You can find that by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com. You can see all the past episodes on YouTube or on all of the audio podcast platforms as well. So thanks for joining here today. Hope you all have a great day. And we'll see you next week on the next version or the next episode of our live discussion. Same time, same place every week, same platforms. Thank you for being here. Have a great week. We'll see you soon. Take care.